It was a cold, bright morning in early October of 1999, in the small mill town of Harnett Creek, Ohio. At 9:42 a.m., the alarm bells at Bishop Falls Middle School rang for a routine fire drill. 400 children filed out onto the frost-bitten athletic field. Every teacher was accounted for. Every student was counted twice. But when the bells stopped and everyone walked back inside, the woman who had rung those bells, the school secretary, Ruth Ellen Vance, was gone. Her coffee was still warm. Her cardigan was still on the back of her chair. Police found no forced entry, no struggle, no trace. The case quickly went cold. 24 years later, one small detail reopened it and revealed a truth no one was prepared for. If stories like this matter to you, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps this small channel keep going. Now, let's get into today's case. To understand what happened inside Bishop Falls Middle School, you first have to understand Ruth Vance, because for 24 years, almost nobody bothered to. Ruth was 51 years old the autumn she vanished. She had worked the front office of that school for 19 years, long enough that half the parents dropping off their kids had once been children signing in late at her desk. She was not a loud woman. She wore soft cardigans and oatmeal in dusty rows, kept a tin of butterscotch candies for nervous first graders, and knew every single child by name, not just the easy ones, all of them. She had a habit of tapping her wedding ring twice against her coffee mug when she was thinking. A small metallic tink-tink that the teachers said they could hear through the office wall. The person who loved her most in the world was her younger brother, Daniel. Daniel Vance was 43 that year, a quiet man who fixed heating systems and boilers for the county. He had been a sickly child asthma, a weak chest, a childhood spent indoors watching other kids play through the window. And Ruth, 9 years older, had half raised him while their mother worked doubles at the paper mill. She was the one who taught him to ride a bike in the gravel lot behind their house, running alongside him with one hand on the seat, letting go before he knew she'd let go. She was the one who sat up with him through the long fever nights, pressing cool cloths to his forehead and reading him the same worn adventure books until her voice gave out. She was the one who drove 2 hours each way, every furlough, to visit him when he was stationed at a base downstate in his 20s, bringing him foil-wrapped meatloaf and news from home. They spoke on the phone every Sunday at 6 o'clock. It was a ritual neither of them had ever broken, not through his marriage and divorce, not through her wedding, not through moves and money troubles and all the small catastrophes of ordinary life. 6 o'clock every Sunday. He'd hear her pick up before she even said hello. That little intake of breath, and then Danny. Just his name. Home in a single word. She was steady, Daniel would say later, his voice going rough, his hands turning his coffee cup around and around. You have to understand, in a world where everything falls apart, where the mill closes and people leave and nothing lasts, Ruth was the one thing that never did. She was my north. When I couldn't find my way, I just pointed myself at her. He paused a long time. And then one Tuesday morning, somebody took my north away and told me she just wandered off. And I knew, right down in my bones, that my sister never wandered anywhere in her life. Ruth had a husband too. His name was Gerald Pohl, and he was by every account charming. He ran a modest insurance office 2 towns over, wore pressed shirts and a splash of expensive cologne, remembered everyone's birthday, and always had a warm, 2-handed handshake ready. People liked Gerald. He laughed easily and tipped well and coached a Little League team on weekends. At church socials, he was the one refilling the coffee urn and telling gentle jokes to the widows. If you had asked anyone in Harnett Creek about Gerald Pohl, They'd have said he was a good man, maybe the last thing from a suspect. But Daniel never trusted him. Not once, not from the first handshake. There was nothing he could point to at the start. Just small things, the kind you file away and feel foolish about. The way Gerald answered questions that had been asked of Ruth smoothly before she could open her mouth. The way he'd rest a hand on the back of her neck in a manner that looked affectionate and felt, somehow, like a leash. The way Ruth had slowly, over a couple of years, stopped coming to Sunday dinners, always with a gentle excuse Gerald wasn't feeling well. Gerald had made plans. Gerald didn't like the drive after dark. And the way, at Thanksgiving of 1997, when Daniel wrapped his sister in a hug, she flinched, just slightly, just at the shoulder, as if she'd forgotten what a kind touch was supposed to feel like, or had learned to brace for a different kind. Something felt wrong, really wrong. But Daniel told himself he was being protective, overprotective even, like a kid brother playing at being a bodyguard. Ruth was a grown woman. She'd chosen Gerald with her eyes open. And she never once, not one single time, said a bad word about him. Whenever Daniel edged near the subject, she'd change it, brightly, firmly, like closing a drawer. "He's good to me, Danny," she said once, and wouldn't meet his eyes when she said it. Still, there was the summer of 1998, a full year before she disappeared, when Daniel stopped by the school on his lunch break to bring her a sandwich from the diner she liked. He came in quiet, and for a moment she didn't hear him. He found her standing at the tall office window, staring out at the empty athletic field at nothing at all. Her wedding ring going tink, 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 tink against her coffee mug faster than usual, a nervous little rhythm. "You okay, Ruthie?" he'd asked. She'd startled hard, one hand flying to her chest, and then she'd laughed and smiled and said she was fine. Just tired. She hadn't been sleeping. The old building kept her company at night when she stayed late doing the books, she said. And it made strange noises, pipes ticking, wind in the old flues, the settling groan of 90-year-old brick. "Sometimes," she said, half joking, rubbing her arms though the room was warm, "it's like the walls are keeping secrets." He laughed too back then. He took a bite of his own sandwich and teased her about being spooked by a school full of 11-year-olds. She swatted his arm and told him to get back to work. He wouldn't laugh about it again for 24 years. And when he finally understood what those walls had been keeping, he would think of that afternoon of his sister standing at the window, listening to a secret that was already, even then, closer than either of them could have dreamed. Daniel would spend a great deal of the next 2 decades convinced that Gerald Pohl had killed his sister. He was wrong about that. But he was right about one thing, the thing that mattered. He was right that Ruth had been afraid of something in her life, and that her fear was real, and that nobody had listened. It would take 24 years to learn that the danger had never been the man she went home to. It had been the building she came to every single morning, and the secrets sleeping in its walls. Bishop Falls Middle School was built in 1931, a hulking brick fortress of a building with tall, arched windows, echoing terrazzo hallways, and the kind of deep, damp basement that generations of students swore was haunted. Its radiators clanked like something alive. Its floors had a smell you never forgot, chalk dust and floor wax and old paper and the faint sweetness of decades of packed lunches. It had been added onto 3 times over the decades. A gymnasium wing in 1948, a science hall in 1962, a hasty renovation in the 1970s that had cut corners in ways nobody would fully understand for another 50 years. The result was a confusing tangle of half staircases that led nowhere, doorways sealed and forgotten, and corridors that didn't quite line up where the old building met the new. The custodians had a running joke that nobody alive had the complete blueprints that the school itself didn't know how big it was. They were closer to right than any of them knew. On the morning of October 4th, 1999, everything was ordinary. It was a Monday, the first genuinely cold morning of the autumn. The kind where the grass on the athletic field had gone silver with frost overnight, and the children arrived with red noses and steaming breath. Ruth arrived at 7:15, as always, in her tan sedan, and let herself in through the side door with the key she'd carried for 19 years. She flipped on the office lights. She made coffee in the office pot, the cheap kind. In the dented aluminum percolator she flatly refused to let the district replace, no matter how many times the vice principal offered to buy a new one. "This one still works," she'd say. "Why throw away a thing that still works?" She sorted the morning attendance slips into their little wooden slots. She signed for a delivery of copy paper. She helped a wheezing sixth grader named Tommy find his rescue inhaler, which had rolled under the nurse's cot, and she gave him a butterscotch candy for his trouble and told him to breathe slow. She took a phone call from a mother whose daughter had a dentist appointment. She tapped her ring against her mug while she thought tink-tink and jotted a note on her spiral pad. At 9:30, the vice principal, a harried younger man named Curtis Doyle, leaned into the office and reminded her that there was a fire drill scheduled for 9:40. Ruth nodded. She finished the last swallow of her coffee. She set the warm mug down on the desk, beside her folded reading glasses and her stack of attendance slips. And at 9:42, Ruth Ellen Vance pressed the alarm. It was the last thing anyone ever saw her do. The bells screamed through the building, that harsh electric clatter that rattled the windows in their old frames. Doors banged open. Children poured out of classrooms in laughing, jostling, half-excited lines, glad for any break in the morning. Teachers herded them with practiced calm. It was cold outside, the first real cold of the season, and 400 breaths came out in little clouds on the frozen field. 400 pairs of shoes crunching across the silver grass. Ruth's job during a drill was simple, and she'd done it dozens of times. Sweep the main office wing, check the front restrooms and the nurse's station and the little back hallways that a lost first grader might duck into. Make sure no one was left behind. Then exit through the side door, pull it shut behind her, and join the staff at their designated spot on the field. She never made it to the field. Nobody thought a thing of it at first. It was chaos out there. 400 kids and 40 adults, everyone counting heads and stamping their feet against the cold. Curtis Doyle, the vice principal, assumed Ruth was somewhere in the crowd. The teachers assumed she was with Doyle. Everyone assumed she was with everyone else. That is how a person disappears in plain sight, in the middle of a crowd, on a bright, cold morning with witnesses everywhere. Not in a lonely place, but in a busy one, where every single person believes she must be with somebody else. The drill lasted 11 minutes. When the all clears sounded and the children came flooding back in, stamping the cold from their feet and rubbing their hands, the front office was empty. At first, Curtis Doyle wasn't alarmed. He figured Ruth had ducked to the ladies' room. He went about the morning. But by 10:15, the phones were ringing with no one to answer them. And a parent was waiting at the front counter, and Ruth's chair was still empty. And that was when Doyle really looked. Her cardigan, the dusty rose one, hung on the back of her chair, exactly where she always kept it. Her reading glasses sat folded on the stack of attendance slips, one earpiece resting on a note in her own handwriting. Her coffee mug sat on the desk. When Doyle, baffled, put his hand against it, it was still faintly warm. There was a ring of her pale lipstick on the rim. Her purse was in the bottom desk drawer where she always kept it, her wallet inside, $41 in cash, and her driver's license untouched. Her car, the tan sedan, sat in its usual space in the staff lot, doors locked, and her keys were nowhere. Not in the office, not in the ignition, not in her purse. Gone. Her coat hung on the rack by the door. It was 38 degrees outside. It was as if Ruth Vance had simply stepped out of her own life mid-sentence, mid-breath, and left everything, even her warmth, behind. Doyle checked the restrooms himself, calling her name, his voice climbing. Then the supply room. Then, with a cold dread spreading through his stomach, the whole wing. He pulled 2 teachers off their classes. Within the hour, they were searching the entire building, every classroom, every janitor's closet, the gymnasium and its locker rooms, the cafeteria and its kitchens, the boiler room, the science hall, the vast damp basement with its forest of pipes. They called her name until they were hoarse. They got nothing but the echo of their own voices bouncing off the old brick. 400 children were sent home early that afternoon, buzzing with the strange electric knowledge that something had gone very wrong. By nightfall, the parking lot of Bishop Falls Middle School was full of police cruisers, their red and blue lights sweeping again and again across the tall, dark windows and the weathered brick. Somewhere inside those walls, closer than any of them would let themselves believe, a woman was still alive. But nobody knew that. Nobody could have known that. Ruth Ellen Vance had vanished without a trace. The detective assigned to the case was a man named Walt Brennan, 26 years on the force and 18 months from retirement. He was tired in the way that men who have seen too much go tired, not sleepy, but worn thin, like an old coat rubbed down to the threads. Brennan did everything right. That was the tragedy of it. He did everything a good detective could do, and it wasn't enough, because the answer was hidden behind a lie written on a piece of paper. He brought in K9 units the very first evening. The dogs took Ruth's scent from her cardigan and her chair, and they tracked it clean and confident out of the office, down the main hall, and around the corner toward the east wing. And then, near an old painted-over door at the far end of that corridor, a stretch of wall that looked like nothing at all, the trail simply stopped. The dogs circled. They whined. They pawed at the base of the wall and looked back at their handlers, confused. They lost her. The handlers backed them off and tried again from the start. Same path, same corner, same dead stop at the same blank stretch of green-painted wall. They tried a third time and a fourth, well into the dark. Every time, Ruth's scent led straight to that wall and vanished, as though she had walked into the brick and dissolved. Dogs don't lie, the lead handler told Brennan, crouched in the cold hallway at midnight, his flashlight on the wall. I've worked these 2 for 6 years. She was here. She stood right here. And then, according to everything they're telling me, she just wasn't. It's like she went straight up, or straight down. Brennan ran his own hand along the wall. Solid, cold, painted the same tired institutional green as everything else. He noticed a heavy old filing cabinet shoved against it, gray steel gathering dust, and he noticed the faintest seam in the paint behind it, but when he checked the building plans spread across the hood of his cruiser, that stretch of wall was marked solid. No door, no room, nothing, just wall. He filed it away. He shouldn't have, but he filed it away. Forensics went over the entire office wing the next morning, dusting every surface. They lifted Ruth's prints and the staff's prints, and, it seemed, 1,000 children's sticky fingerprints from every door frame and counter. What they did not find was anything violent. No blood, no sign of a struggle, no overturned chair, no scuff marks, no torn fabric, nothing dragged. The side door Ruth should have exited through during the drill was locked from the inside, exactly as protocol required, exactly as it should have been. No one had gone out that way. No window was open or broken. No stranger had been seen on the grounds. The school had been full of witnesses, 400 children and 40 adults, all outside on an open field with clear sightlines to every exterior door. And not one of them had seen Ruth Vance leave the building. Because she hadn't. They dragged Harnett Creek, the shallow river the town was named for. They searched the woods behind the school with 100 volunteers walking arm's length apart. They questioned every teacher, every janitor, every parent who'd been near the building. They dragged Harnett Creek, the shallow, stony river the town was named for, running lines and grappling hooks through the cold water for 3 days. They found a bicycle, a shopping cart, and a rusted stove. They did not find Ruth. They searched the woods behind the school with 100 volunteers walking arm's length apart. A slow human comb dragging across acres of falling autumn leaves. They found nothing but deer trails and old bottles. They questioned every teacher, every janitor, every parent who had been anywhere near the building. They ran down every stranger anyone remembered seeing. They chased tips for months, a woman matching Ruth's description at a bus station in Columbus, a sighting at a diner 3 counties over, an anonymous call claiming she'd run off with a lover. Every lead dissolved into nothing. Ruth had no lover. Ruth had no debts, no secrets anyone knew of, no reason on earth to walk away from her life and leave her purse and her keys and her little brother behind. And of course, they questioned Gerald Pohl. Hard. Gerald was devastated, or seemed to be. He wept openly in the interview room, a big man with his face in his hands. And he said over and over that he had no idea why anyone would want to hurt Ruth, that their marriage was happy, that she must have been taken by some monster. He said he'd give anything, anything, to have her back. But his alibi was airtight, and it drove Brennan half mad. Gerald had been at his insurance office 19 miles away all morning, with 2 clients in the waiting room and a secretary at the front desk, all 3 of whom swore he never once left the building during the hours in question. The phone records backed it up, calls placed from his office line straight through the morning. Gerald Pohl simply could not have been at Bishop Falls Middle School when his wife disappeared. It was not physically possible. Brennan didn't like him anyway. Couldn't help it. Something about the tears felt a half-second late, a touch too practiced, like a man who had watched other people grieve and was doing an impression of it. And once, just once, when Brennan mentioned, almost offhand, that Ruth's coffee had still been warm when they found her mug, Gerald's face did something strange, a flicker, a tightening around the eyes, there and gone, quickly smoothed away. For years afterward, Brennan would wonder about that flicker. He'd decide, eventually, that it meant nothing that a grieving husband's face might do anything. He was right, as it turned out. Though not in the way he thought. Gerald Pohl was a controlling, cold, unpleasant man who had made his wife smaller and quieter every year of their marriage. But he had not killed her. On that one specific, terrible morning, Gerald Pohl was innocent. The town would suspect him for 2 decades. Daniel would hate him for 2 decades. And the whole time, the real answer sat sealed behind a painted door that everyone had walked right past. A bad feeling, Brennan knew, isn't evidence. And every hard fact pointed away from Gerald. So the case, having no villain it could name and no body it could find, began slowly to die. But there was one clue that haunted Walt Brennan. Long after he'd handed in his badge, one loose thread he could never stop tugging at in the small hours of the night. The stairwell. That sealed door where the dogs lost the scent. It led to an old stairwell that, according to the district's paperwork, had been bricked up and abandoned in the 1970s during one of the school's renovations. The door was painted the same institutional green as the wall, its handle removed, a filing cabinet shoved in front of it. It looked, for all the world, like it hadn't been opened in 30 years. Brennan wanted to open it, but the district superintendent refused. The stairwell was structurally unsound, he insisted, full of asbestos and crumbling concrete. Opening it would cost a fortune and endanger the search team. Besides, the paperwork was clear. It was sealed solid. There was no cavity behind that door, big enough to hide a person. It was, the superintendent said, just a wall with a door painted on it, basically. Brennan pushed. The superintendent pushed back harder, citing liability, citing budgets, citing the children who needed the school reopened. In the end, exhausted and out of leverage, Brennan let it go. He told himself the dogs had simply been confused by the building's weird air currents. He told himself a lot of things. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. But he was one tired man against a wall of paperwork. And the paperwork won. 6 months later, Walt Brennan retired. The case went cold, and the sealed stairwell stayed sealed. For Daniel Vance, the years that followed were a slow, grinding erosion, the kind that wears a man down. Not all at once, but a grain at a time, until one day he looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize what's left. The first year was the worst kind of hope. The constant flinch every time the phone rang. The way his heart leapt into his throat at every stranger in a grocery store with gray hair and a soft rose-colored cardigan. He drove past the school at least once a week and sat in the lot staring at the tall windows, as if the building might somehow give her back if he just watched it long enough. He put up flyers until the flyers faded. He called Detective Brennan so often the man learned his ringtone. And he kept Ruth's Sunday call time sacred. Every Sunday at 6 o'clock, Daniel sat by the phone in his kitchen. It never rang. He sat anyway an hour, sometimes 2, in the deepening dark, one hand resting on the silent receiver. It was the only appointment he never missed for 24 years. Their mother, Eleanor, could not survive it. She had already been frail, her hands shaking, her heart weak. And losing Ruth broke something in her that would not mend. She stopped eating more than a few bites at a sitting. She stopped talking except to ask, again and again, whether there was any news. She took to sitting in her chair by the front window with a blanket over her knees, watching the road, as if Ruth might come walking up at any minute now, home late from work, apologizing for the fright she'd caused. "She'll come up that road," Eleanor would murmur. "You watch." She was always good about calling if she was going to be late. In the spring of 2003, 3.5 years after the disappearance, Eleanor Vance died in that same chair, in her sleep, still facing the window. The doctors wrote heart failure on the certificate. Daniel called it what it was, a broken heart. He was not wrong. At the funeral, Gerald Poles showed up in a well-cut black suit, took Daniel's hand in both of his, and said, in that warm, awful voice, "She's in a better place now, both of them." Daniel stood very still and felt something cold move through his chest, slow as ice water. Both of them. As if Gerald already knew, as if he'd decided that Ruth was dead and gone and settled, a closed matter, a finished grief. Daniel searched the man's face for a crack, for a confession, for anything. He found only that smooth, sorrowful mask. "You don't know that," Daniel said. "You don't know she's gone." Gerald squeezed his hand and gave him a look of terrible, patient pity. "Daniel," he said gently, "it's been years. You have to let yourself heal." Daniel pulled his hand back and did not speak to Gerald Pohl again for 2 decades. He was certain, in that moment, and for a very long time after, that he was standing in front of the man who had murdered his sister. He had no proof. He never got any proof. He would go to his own grave, he thought, without ever knowing. He was wrong. But you could not have told him that. You could not have told anyone that. Gerald remarried in 2005, a widow from his church, and moved into a bigger house on the good side of town with a wide green lawn. He kept coaching Little League. He kept refilling the coffee urn at socials. Life, for Gerald Pohl, went on comfortably. And if he ever felt the weight of the town's quiet suspicion, he never showed it. He died in 2019 of a heart attack on his own patio, a free man. Daniel did not go to the funeral. Daniel's life did not go on. It simply continued, which is a different thing. He kept fixing boilers for the county, kneeling in cold basements with a wrench in his hand, and he was good at it, and it filled the hours. He never married. He'd loved a woman for a while in his 50s, a kind widow named Grace, but he could never quite let her all the way in, could never quite close the door on the room where he kept his sister, and eventually Grace, gently, let him go. He understood. He didn't blame her. He kept a photograph of Ruth in his wallet until the creases wore the image soft, the two of them at Lake Anders when he was small, maybe 7 years old, her arm around his narrow shoulders, both of them squinting and grinning into the summer sun. On the back, in her handwriting, Danny's first swim. So brave. He talked to her sometimes, out loud, alone in his truck on the long drives between jobs. "Where'd you go, Ruthie?" he'd ask the empty passenger seat, the wipers ticking against the rain. "Where in God's name did you go?" The seat never answered, but he asked anyway. It was another kind of Sunday call. 10 years passed, then 15, then 20. Harnett Creek changed the way small towns change quietly, and then all at once. The paper mill that had employed half the town, that had killed their mother's lungs and paid for their childhood, shut its gates for good in 2011. Storefronts on Main went dark. Young people left. The population shrank in grade. And Bishop Falls Middle School, that old brick fortress on the hill, was finally deemed too outdated, too expensive, too full of asbestos and bad wiring to keep running. In the spring of 2023, the district announced that the 92-year-old building would be demolished and a bright new school built in its place. Daniel read about it in the Harnett Creek Courier over his morning coffee, at the same kitchen table where he'd sat by the phone for 24 years of Sundays. And something in him, some old, buried animal instinct he couldn't name, sat straight up. They were going to tear the building down. The building where Ruth vanished. The building with the sealed stairwell that a tired detective had begged to open, and that a superintendent had fought like the devil to keep shut. Something felt wrong. Really wrong. He didn't know why. He couldn't have explained it to anyone. He barely understood it himself. But he clipped that article out of the paper with kitchen scissors, and he stuck it to his refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a little red apple. And he stood in front of it and stared at it for weeks, the way his mother had once stared at an empty road. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. And yet, he could not shake the feeling that the building was about to say something it had been holding in for a very long time. The clue, when it finally came from a man who never knew Ruth Vance at all. His name was Marcus Reyes. and he was 44 years old, the facilities manager hired by the demolition contractor to survey Bishop Falls Middle School before it came down. His job was unglamorous. Walk the building room by room, document its condition, flag hazards, and map out every space that would need to be cleared before the wrecking crews arrived. He carried a clipboard, a heavy flashlight, a tape measure, and a set of the district's original floor plans. The floor plans were the problem. Or rather, the floor plans were a lie, and Marcus Reyes was exactly the wrong kind of man to lie to. Marcus was meticulous to the point of stubbornness. He'd spent 20 years in building maintenance and demolition survey, and he had a near physical sense of space, the kind of person who walks into a room and feels, in his gut, when a ceiling is lower than it should be, or a wall is closer than it looks. His co-workers teased him about it. His wife called it his sixth sense. It was really just 20 years of paying close attention to the bones of buildings, which is a form of respect most people never learn. He worked slowly and alone through the condemned school across several gray afternoons in late September of 2023. Moving room by room with his clipboard, his heavy rubber flashlight, his 50-foot tape measure, and a rolled set of the district's original blueprints. He measured every space and checked it against the plans, flagging hazards in red ink. Asbestos here, live wiring there, a floor gone soft with rot. It was quiet, dusty, lonely work. The building was full of the ghosts of ordinary life. A faded height chart still taped to a classroom wall. A lost mitten petrified under a radiator. Chalk trays still holding stubs of chalk. Autumn light came slanting gold and dust thick through the tall, dirty windows. And then he got to the east wing, and the numbers stopped adding up. The main east corridor, according to the blueprints, ran 94 feet from the corner of the old office wing to the exterior wall. Marcus stretched his tape and measured it. 86 feet. He frowned. He rewound the tape and measured it again, walking it heel to toe to be sure. 86. He measured it a third time from the opposite end. 86 feet. 8 feet were missing. He stood alone in that empty, dust-choked hallway, and he frowned at his tape measure, and then he frowned at the wall. 8 feet don't just disappear. A blueprint might be off by an inch, maybe two, from decades of settling and replastering. But not 8 feet. 8 feet is a closet. 8 feet is a utility chase. 8 feet is a small room somebody didn't want on the plans. 8 feet is something. He walked the length of the end wall slowly, close, running his flashlight beam along the tired, institutional green paint at a low angle. The way you look at a surface when you want it to give up its secrets. Ordinary wall, ordinary wall. And then near the far corner, half hidden behind a heavy gray steel filing cabinet that looked like it hadn't moved in decades, the light caught something. A seam, a faint rectangle in the paint, painted over and over so many times it had nearly melted into the wall. But there, unmistakably there, once you saw it. The ghost of a door. No handle, no hinges visible. Just an outline, and beneath the outline, low down, a thin, dark line where the bottom edge didn't quite meet the floor. Marcus checked his blueprints, holding the flashlight in his teeth. On the plans, that stretch of wall was solid. There was no door there. There had never been a door there. Every instinct he had told him otherwise. He set down his clipboard. He put his shoulder against the filing cabinet and shoved it screeching across the terrazzo. He took the flat pry bar from his belt and worked it into the painted seam. And the old paint cracked and flaked. And he felt the give of a real door behind it. A real door with a real gap behind it, where the plans swore there was only brick. He worked the bar down the seam and pulled. The door came open with a shriek of rusted hinges, a sound that seemed to echo through the whole empty building. And a breath of air rolled out to meet him. Cold, stale, dead air that had been sealed away from the world for 24 years. It smelled of concrete and dust, and underneath, something else. Something old and organic that made the hair on his arms stand up before his mind even knew why. His flashlight beam fell past the door onto a narrow flight of concrete stairs descending steeply into total darkness. And at the bottom of those stairs, half swallowed by shadow, small and still and terribly patient, was a shape. What he saw when the light found it made his blood run cold. Marcus Reyes did not go down those stairs. He backed away, his heart slamming, and he called the police from the hallway with a shaking hand. Within the hour, Bishop Falls Middle School was ringing with sirens again, just as it had 24 years before. Yellow tape went up, floodlights were carried in, and a forensic team descended, slowly and carefully, into a stairwell that the paperwork had sworn did not exist. Word travels fast in a small town. A demolition crew calls the police call the coroner, and somebody's cousin hears it on a scanner. And by supper time, half of Harnett Creek knew that they'd found something inside the old school. Daniel heard it from a neighbor, standing on his porch in the blue October dusk. He didn't finish the conversation. He got in his truck and drove. By evening, he was standing at the yellow tape line strung across the school parking lot, his old truck idling behind him with the door hanging open, watching the floodlights move behind the tall, dark windows of the east wing. His hands were shaking. He didn't feel the cold. A young officer came over and told him, not unkindly, that he'd have to move along, that this was an active scene. Daniel didn't move. "My sister disappeared in that building," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the windows. 24 years ago, this month. Ruth Vance. She was the secretary. Whatever's down there. His voice caught. He made himself say it. "Whatever you found down there, I have a right to know." The officer opened her mouth to repeat herself. Then she looked at his face, really looked at the 24 years written into it, and whatever she saw there made her close her mouth. She keyed her radio instead, and spoke into it low, and told him to wait right there, and not to cross the tape. He waited. He'd been waiting a very long time. He was good at it. The detective who came out to meet him was young, maybe 35, a woman named Priya Osei, who had inherited a stack of cold cases when she made detective and had actually bothered to read them. She knew the name Ruth Vance. She knew the name Walt Brennan. And she knew, the moment she saw the sealed stairwell, exactly which file was about to come screaming back to life. "Mr. Vance," she said gently, "we don't have confirmation yet, but I think you should sit down." They had found remains at the bottom of the stairwell. A woman, and with the remains, preserved in the dry, sealed cold of that concrete tomb, were the things she'd had with her when she died. A set of keys, a pair of sensible flat shoes, and, still clasped around the delicate bones of one finger, a plain gold wedding ring. Daniel didn't need the DNA test that would come later. He knew. He had always known, somewhere deep beneath the years of hope. He sat down on the cold curb of the parking lot, put his face in his hands, and for the first time in 24 years, Daniel Vance wept without any hope left to hold him up. Ruth had never left the building at all. But finding Ruth was not the end of the mystery. It was the beginning of a new one. Because the stairwell told a story that made no sense. The forensic reconstruction, pieced together over the following weeks was strange and unsettling, and it only deepened the mystery instead of closing it. Ruth had not been murdered, at least, not in any way the evidence could show. There was no sign of a blow to the skull from a weapon, no defensive fracture, no indication of a struggle at the bottom of those stairs. Her injuries told a story of a fall, and nothing but a fall. A shattered ankle, a broken wrist where she'd flung out a hand to catch herself, a serious injury to the back of the head. The medical examiner was cautious, careful, but the picture was fairly clear. Ruth Vance had gone down those steep concrete stairs hard, and the fall had broken her badly. And at the bottom, injured and unable to climb, she had died, not instantly, the examiner believed, but over some hours, perhaps as much as a day. It looked, for all the world, like a terrible accident. But accidents don't seal themselves behind painted doors. Someone had shut that stairwell after Ruth went down into it. Someone had pulled the door closed and shoved a 200-pound steel filing cabinet back in front of it. Someone had stood in that hallway while a search team combed the building, while trained dogs pawed and whined at that exact stretch of wall, while a desperate detective ran his hand over the paint and wondered, and that someone had said nothing, had let the search fail, had let the case go cold, had let a woman's warm coffee turn to a legend, and let her brother wait by a phone for 24 years. That was the crime, not the fall, the silence. Detective Priya Osei reopened everything. She pulled Walt Brennan's original file out of cold storage, all its yellowed pages, and she read every word. And there, in Brennan's own frustrated handwriting from the winter of 1999, she found the thread. Sealed stairwell E-wing. K9 loses scent here ×4. Requested access. Denied by Superintendent Fenner. Cites asbestos/structural/liability. Pushed. Denied again. Something wrong here. Something wrong here. Brennan had known. He'd known and been overruled. So Osei started with the one man who had fought hardest 24 years before to keep that particular door shut. The school superintendent who had refused again and again to let Walt Brennan open it. His name was Harold Fenner. And by the autumn of 2023, he was 81 years old, a widower, living out his last chapter in a tidy care facility on the edge of town. His body failing him by inches, his mind, unfortunately for him, still perfectly clear. Osei went to see him on a rainy Thursday. She found a frail old man in a cardigan, not so different from the ones Ruth used to wear, sitting by a window with a crossword he wasn't doing. She made small talk. She asked him if he remembered the disappearance of Ruth Vance. He said, of course, a terrible thing, a terrible thing. She asked him if he remembered the sealed stairwell in the East Wing. The old man's hands went still on his lap. Then Osei took out a photograph, a printout of the opened stairwell, the dark descending stairs, the small marked shape at the bottom, and she laid it gently on the table in front of him. Harold Fenner looked at it for a long moment, and then his face crumpled. And this 81-year-old man began, very quietly, to cry, the tears running down into the deep folds of his face. "I told myself she got out," he whispered. "God forgive me. For 24 years, every single day, I told myself she must have gotten out somehow. That she stopped because she climbed out. That she was alive somewhere. I made myself believe it because I couldn't." His voice broke entirely. "Because I could not live inside the other thing." And then, at last, in a small, quiet room with the rain running down the glass, the truth came out. Harold Fenner was not a killer. That was the terrible, human heart of it. In 1999, Harold had a secret, a small, shameful, ordinary secret. For nearly a decade, he had been quietly stealing from the school district. Not enormous sums. A padded invoice here, a phantom contractor there. A maintenance budget skimmed a few $1,000s at a time. Enough to cover his gambling debts. Enough to keep his own private disaster hidden from his wife, his colleagues, his church. And the place Harold kept his records, the second set of books, the cash, the evidence of everything he'd done, was the old sealed stairwell in the East Wing. It was the perfect hiding place. According to the district's own paperwork, the stairwell didn't exist. It had been sealed in the 1970s, except Harold, when he became superintendent, had discovered that the seal was a lie. The door had only ever been painted over and blocked, never truly bricked shut. Behind it, the stairwell was hollow and dry and utterly forgotten. Harold had quietly kept a key to a padlock he'd installed on the inside mechanism, and he used the space as his own private vault. On the morning of October 4th, 1999, Harold Fenner made a fatal mistake. He had come to the school early to move some of his cash out of the stairwell. He was getting nervous. A state auditor had been asking questions, and in his hurry, he had left the hidden door unlocked and very slightly ajar. Just a crack, just enough. Then the fire drill bells rang, and Harold, caught off guard, had to rush out to the field with everyone else, unable to go back and secure the door without being seen. And Ruth Vance steady. Thorough Ruth, who swept the wing during every drill to make sure no child was left behind, noticed the door standing open. A door that had been sealed her entire 19 years at that school. A door that whispered, that made the walls seem like they were keeping secrets. She pushed it open. She looked inside, and in the dim light, she saw the neat stacks of cash, the ledgers, the whole ugly truth of what her superintendent had been doing. Then she took one step too far onto the top stair, old, crumbling, treacherous concrete, and it gave way beneath her foot. Ruth fell, all the way down, and at the bottom, in the dark, badly injured and unable to climb, she was trapped in a place that officially did not exist, in a building that 400 people had just walked back into without her. Harold Fenner found her that afternoon. After the search had begun, after the panic had spread through the school, Harold had slipped away to the East Wing to check his terrible secret. And there he found the door ajar, and heard from the darkness below a sound he would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. Ruth was still alive. She was calling out, weakly, in pain, but alive, calling for help, calling for anyone. And Harold Fenner stood at the top of those stairs and faced the worst decision of his life. If he called for help, Ruth would be saved, but everything down there would be exposed. His theft, his debts, his ruin, his disgrace, prison, the loss of everything. If he did nothing, the door would stay a secret. He told himself later that he panicked, that he meant to come back, that he needed time to think, to move the money, to figure out a way to save her without destroying himself. He told himself he'd only close the door for a little while. He closed the door. He shoved the filing cabinet back in front of it, and he walked away from Ruth Vance's calls for help. He never opened it again. When Detective Brennan wanted to search the stairwell, Harold fought him with everything he had, the asbestos lie, the budget lie, the liability lie, because he knew what Brennan would find. Not just his crimes. By then he knew he would find something far worse. I kept thinking she'd stop calling because she got out, he told Osei, tears running down his ruined old face. I made myself believe it. Every single day, for 24 years, I made myself believe she got out. Because the other thing, I could not survive believing. He had let a woman die in the dark to protect a secret about money. And then he had spent the rest of his life building a prison of denial around his own heart, more sealed and airless than the stairwell itself. The truth broke over Harnett Creek like a wave. Harold Fenner was charged not with murder, which the law could not quite prove, but with a raft of crimes that finally put a name to what he'd done. Embezzlement, obstruction, and the negligent, deliberate failure to render aid that had cost Ruth Vance her life. He was too frail for a long trial. He pleaded guilty to all of it, in a courtroom where Daniel Vance sat in the front row and looked him dead in the eyes. Harold did not look away this time. To his small credit, at the very end, he did not look away. "I'm sorry," the old man said, his voice barely a whisper, when the judge allowed him to speak. "I have no right to your forgiveness. I stole your sister's life to save my own, and my own wasn't worth saving. I have carried her voice for 24 years. I will carry it into the ground." He was sentenced to spend his remaining years in state custody. He died there 14 months later. Some said he'd finally stopped fighting to breathe. Daniel said nothing at all about Harold Fenner's death. The man had never been the point. Ruth was the point. And there was one more thing, one small mercy pulled from the wreckage. When the forensic team had recovered Ruth's remains, they'd found, tucked into the pocket of her cardigan, a small spiral notepad, the kind she used at her desk for phone messages. The cold, dry air of the stairwell had preserved it. And in it, in the shaky handwriting of a woman injured and frightened and alone in the dark, were her last words. She had not written about Harold. She had not written in anger or fear or blame. She had written to Daniel. "Danny," it read, "if someone finds this, tell Danny I wasn't scared, not really. I kept thinking about the lake and you learning to swim, how you were so scared of the deep part, and I held your hand, and you did it anyway. You were always braver than you knew. I'm not scared. Sunday at 6, I'll be listening. Love always, Ruthie." Sunday at 6, their call time. She had spent her last hours in the dark thinking of her little brother, telling him not to be afraid. Daniel held that notepad against his chest and wept in a way that finally, after 24 years, had somewhere to go. They buried Ruth Vance in the spring of 2024 beside their mother, under a maple tree that turned to fire every October. The whole town came. The children she'd once known by name grown now, with children of their own, came and left butterscotch candies on her headstone, a small golden pile of them glinting in the sun. The vice principal came, gray and weeping. Even old Walt Brennan came, the tired detective, 82 now and leaning on a cane, and he stood at the grave a long time. "I should have opened that door," he told Daniel. "I'm sorry I didn't fight harder." Daniel put a hand on the old man's shoulder. "You believed the paperwork," he said. "We all did. That's how they get away with it. They count on us believing the paper over the person. Marcus Reyes came too, the facilities manager, the meticulous stranger whose tape measure had refused to lie. He hadn't known Ruth. He'd only known that 8 feet were missing from a hallway, and he'd cared enough to ask why. Daniel shook his hand and could not find the words, so he just held on, and Marcus held on back, and that was enough. On the headstone, beneath Ruth's name and the dates, Daniel had them carve 4 small words. She never left us. Because she hadn't. She'd been there the whole time in the walls of that old school, in the notepad in her pocket, in the little brother she'd taught to be brave. The building was torn down that summer. And where the east wing had stood, where the hidden stairwell had swallowed a good woman for 24 years, they planted a garden. There's a lie we tell ourselves about the people who vanish. We tell ourselves they ran, that they chose to leave, that they got tired, that they walked away and didn't look back. It's easier, somehow, to believe in abandonment than in the alternative that they were taken or trapped or lost within reach of hands that never came. But the people who vanish aren't always running away. Sometimes they're calling out, in the dark, just on the other side of a door. We're too afraid or too busy or too willing to believe the paperwork to open. Ruth Vance was 9 feet from a hallway full of people. 9 feet for 24 years. What saved her in the end was not a detective or a machine or a stroke of luck. It was a stranger who noticed that something didn't add up, and a brother who never, not for one single Sunday, stopped listening for the phone to ring. The truth cannot stay buried forever. Not under concrete, not under paperwork, not under 24 years of a frightened man's denial. It waits. It waits in the walls. And it waits for someone who loves enough, or cares enough, to measure the hallway one more time. In the end, love proved stronger than the darkness, stronger than the years, stronger than the silence, stronger than the sealed and painted door. Ruth spent her last hours telling her brother not to be afraid. And Daniel spent the rest of his life making sure the world finally heard her. Sunday at 6, she was always listening. And in the end, so was he.